Welcome everyone, Kelly here from Carcraft Auto Tech, and today we're going to do a cooling system service on my 2015 Toyota Tacoma. Well, let's get started. First things first, most people will probably start this with the vehicle cold. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That works perfectly fine. For me, I actually don't mind if the vehicle is warm and almost prefer it in all. So there's nothing wrong with starting with it warm. If you do that, you must obviously be aware that we can't just open the radiator cap if it's hot and has pressure in there. So let's just quickly go over a technique of opening the cap if it is warm to make sure that there's no pressure in there. You don't want to get burned, obviously. So let's have a look. Okay, so we're just over top of the engine here. Obviously we got our radiator cap here, we have our reservoir here, and we have our upper radiator hose. Basically we're going to feel this hose to feel how firm it is. On a full operating temperature vehicle, it can build up to about 14-15 pounds of pressure in here, and it would feel pretty hard. Even with a full system, it does feel like it has something in there, some resistance obviously from the rubber and the hose, but I can tell this one, I can squeeze it in pretty easily, so I feel pretty confident that I can just go ahead and open this cap. Always just do it slowly anyways, and there's no pressure in there. Let's just say this vehicle was quite warm, just ran, and we feel the hose and it's a little bit firm, and we believe there's a little bit of pressure in there. There is a way to do this reasonably safe, to just double check. What I usually like to do is take my one finger or hand and push. Let's see, try and get that on camera. I'm pushing downwards, so I'm pushing down on this, and I'm going to take my other two and I'm going to rotate the cap to the open position. So we rotate it like this, and at this point, if there was pressure in there, you could feel a little bit of pressure coming up, and we could lightly tilt the cap, and if we feel like it's going to come out, then we can quickly turn this back, and without getting ourselves in too much danger. You do not want to get into the scenario where you're kind of there and you want to quickly pull away. That's really not a good idea. Even like it always says, caution, never open when hot. So if you want to stay on the safe side, just don't open it, just wait it out, and yeah, you'll be okay obviously that way. Here we are underneath the vehicle accessing the drain plug. It's on the bottom left side of the radiator. Mine was a little bit too tight to do with fingers, so I just grabbed a little pair of pliers and turned it. It is a standard thread, so counterclockwise we'll go ahead and open it. So just get this cracked open, let's get it draining, make sure you don't pour it all over yourself. I usually like to open the drain plug first. There's usually a little bit of like fluid air vacuum, I guess, I don't know what you want to call it, in the system. So when you open the radiator drain plug first, the fluid doesn't immediately pour like crazy. If you give it some time, it'll create some air in there, it'll start pouring out. Open the drain plug, then go ahead and open the radiator cap. Second is basically my point. So we got that going. Let's go ahead and get them opened up. Well, we got the coolant draining, and now we're going to obviously start to get prepared for putting the coolant in. Now, here at the shop, we would do this a few different ways of doing this coolant service. Obviously, I'm just going to briefly tell you how that would be. We're not going to show you that today because you're not going to have that kind of equipment at home. Here we have a coolant exchange machine. There's all different kinds of them that shops will use. It basically just interrupts the hose, and it has a new and an old side, and it'll transfer the fluid while the vehicle is running. I have an electric pump and clean out old fluid and then new in the other side. So we're not using that today because you're not going to have that at home. So I'm not going to show that kind of stuff here. Usually I like to show the stuff so that's going to help you so you can do this at home. Here's another great piece of equipment that most people just aren't going to have at home. This is a full cooling system kit. We have basically this portion of the tool here. This is for creating a vacuum inside the cooling system, and then it essentially sucks the coolant in and will fill up the vehicle. Most people really aren't going to have this at home. If you did, I'm going to go ahead and make the assumption that you do know how to use it, but we are not going to be using this today. It is really great. This is the best way to do this, but like I said, you're not going to more than likely have this at home. We're going to do this old school. We're just going to pour it in and try and bleed it normally. Not exactly sure if you can hear or not, but the coolant has now stopped dripping out. So I'm satisfied that it's empty. I'm going to go ahead, lift the vehicle back up. We're going to close that drain plug, make sure it's good, and we're going to go ahead, start putting the fluid back in. So let's get it done. Okay, so we got drain plug closed. We're not using any machines. We're going to start pouring in some coolant. Now, what coolant are we going to use? Feel free, use factory coolant. Obviously going to work really well for you. We can use some aftermarket coolant. I got some Pentazine Pentafrost coolant here. Feel free. I'm going to let you guys debate on what you guys like to use. Really, I don't think it's going to matter for the most part. These require all long life coolants. If you're using any long life coolant, even if it's a generic one, it should be just fine. The one thing I will not leave open for debate is when you should do it. In my opinion, do not wait until the manufactured specification. I find that over a period of time, the coolant gets, it's acidic, it's just not good. I would change it early. That's the one thing I would definitely do. Feel free to use whatever you want, change it early, don't wait till the end. I'll quickly, I haven't looked it up actually, I'm going to look up the factory specification on when the recommendation is. I'll sort of put it down in the words here or whatever after. So yeah, let's go ahead, let's start getting some coolant in this thing. Well, just before we start pouring the coolant in, we got to do one quick thing I forgot to quickly mention is your coolant reservoir. Obviously there's some old coolant left over in this guy. Now you're going to want to go ahead and on this vehicle here, we have this nice handy little drain plug down here. So we're going to go ahead and take this off. There's basically a spring clamp on here. We're going to go ahead, squeeze it, pull the little rubber off, and it's going to go ahead and drain out the coolant. If you happen to be working on something else and it doesn't have this exact type, usually you can pull them out or you can go ahead and unbolt them, take them out. If it's really ugly, go ahead, get in there, wash this thing out maybe with some soap and water, rinse it out, make sure it's nice and clean, and we're going to go ahead and apply some fresh antifreeze to this after. So I have one tool that I am going to use. Now this is something that, I would recommend that you consider getting for home. It's really not that expensive. It's a spill-free funnel. So what that consists of is essentially a top funnel like this. It comes with a plunger like this. So once the coolant's full, we can go ahead and stop it from leaking out. And what it'll do is it'll come with a few different caps like this. We're going to go ahead and just apply this right to the top, sort of like the radiator cap. Hooks on there, and you can see it's kind of on there. And we're going to go ahead and put the funnel on there, and we're going to go ahead and start filling it up. Obviously, start pouring it up, and we're going to fill it up to probably just right around here, and we're going to go ahead and start the vehicle up. So let's get that going for now. Okay, so started pouring the coolant in. Doing it this way, undoubtedly we have air in the cooling system right now. So what a lot of people don't realize is that they think that you can just go ahead and just pour the coolant back up and it's just going to fill right to the top and we're good to go. That is just not the case. Older vehicles, back in the day, they had a really simple cooling system, a radiator, engine, and a heater core for your hot air. Nowadays, a lot of the vehicles are very complicated cooling systems. There's many different hose passages that go to this, that, and it's very complicated. So what ends up by happening is, because those passages aren't just sort of all connected into one directly, sort of gray area there, what happens is the coolant, when you pour it into the radiator, it just can't fill up into all those passages. So we have to bleed that air out of the system. So I know I have air in here for sure because it did not fill all the way. I probably got very close to one jug in there, so about 4 liters or so, gallon. So I know it's going to need to accept more. You can see what you took out in your drain pan. You could do an approximation of what you have out and what you got to put back in, but I know there's not enough. So that's where this funnel comes in handy. What will happen is we're going to go ahead, we're going to start the vehicle, and we're going to start to bring it up to temperature. And what we're going to watch for, because what can happen is when you get an airlock, sometimes it wants to try to overheat and kick the fluid out because it's not where it needs to be inside the engine. So we'll see if this does that. Hopefully it does not. Doing it this way, you can run into a little bit of trouble where you get airlock into it and trouble bleeding it out. But let's go ahead, let's just get this thing fired up and we're going to see how this thing bleeds out. Okay, so I went ahead, started the vehicle. Obviously you can hear it's running. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna let this thing idle for a couple of minutes. Obviously we're not gonna show you that. So we're just gonna let this thing run up to temperature a little bit, and we're gonna watch and make sure that we are not starting to see, we're gonna watch the fluid is not coming up and rising out of here. So I got the level set to it right around here. So let's go ahead. It's gonna let this thing idle for a couple of minutes and I'll jump back to you when I see something happening. So it's been about 3 or 4 minutes. I've been watching the temperature gauge. It has come up a little bit, about quarter way or so. My fluid level is still right about here. So nothing's really happened. There's maybe a little bit of bubbles coming up, nothing really too much majorly. So at this point, we can go ahead, we can let it sit and wait and idle it up a little bit. Or what we can do, you can do this alone. It's easier if you have 2 people, one can watch, one can do the pedal. We're gonna go ahead and we're going to raise the RPM to approximately about 2,000 RPM, and we're gonna really try and entice this thing to heat up and get that thermostat open so we can get the cooling system circulating and we can get that air that's gonna be trapped up in the upper hoses or in the upper portion of the engine. That being said, make sure you are not getting too high in temperature. If there happens to be air in there and it wants to try to overheat and you see your cooling gauge coming up, go ahead, just shut it off and we're gonna restart from there. We'll try to add more fluid or try to get the air out of it some other way. But yeah, let's go ahead, let's start. I'm gonna go right now. I'm gonna go in the vehicle and I'm gonna bring the RPM up to about 2,000 RPM and we're gonna get this thing warm. Okay, so I've had the vehicle running. I let it idle for a couple of minutes, let that kind of warm up, put in some more fluid. Then I went ahead and I went in and I raised the RPMs up to about 2,000 RPM and then I checked it after a couple of minutes. Fluid still hadn't really moved around too much. So I went back into the vehicle and I actually was a little more aggressive. I raised it up to around 3,000, 3,500, and I probably held it there for probably a pretty solid at least 6 to 7 minutes. Then I could see the fluid start to move around a little bit. It went down a little bit, signifying that the thermostat opened. Another way that you can check that is you can touch the upper radiator hose and the lower. The upper will probably get warm almost right away, but the lower will not. That will signify when the thermostat is opening. Be very careful sticking your hands inside. There's a moving fan in there. You obviously don't want to be sticking your hands into the fan. That being said, you can also just put your hand in front of the fan wind, basically the air that it's blowing away. If it feels like it's blowing warm air, that means there's warm fluid circulating through the radiator. So, pretty safe. We know we got enough fluid in there. It definitely didn't overheat or anything. The temperature never came up when I was revving it, not aggressively, but revving it up. One thing that I'm gonna note, you're gonna say, okay, well, what if I don't have this fancy funnel thing? That's fine. What you're gonna wanna do is leave the radiator down just about a hair. So that way it has a little bit of room to move up and down. Do the same revving procedure, do all of that, just leave the radiator a little bit low. Not very low, but maybe down maybe an inch or 2 from the top. That way it has a little bit of room to expand without spilling over. If it spills over a little bit, no big deal. Just make sure it's not gushing out a bunch of fluid. So we're very close to being circulated. I would say pretty much done at this point. I would go ahead and cap it off and road test it. Nothing really gets it warm quite like road testing it. So we'll road test it. Then what I would like to do is let it sit half an hour, even overnight. And then before you drive it the next day, recheck the fluid level right away. More than likely you're going to find that it's gone down a little bit. There's a little bit of air in there. Top off the overflow reservoir and you're basically done. So I was going to do a couple quick checks here. So this is where the funnel comes in super handy. I still have some coolant in here. We're going to go ahead and take this plunger. We can stick it in there. Pull that off. Essentially we're not really spilling that much, a couple little drips, and we can save this. We can either put it back into the coolant reservoir if you need a little bit of extra, or you can put it into your bottle if you have any extras and save that for later. Now would be an absolute excellent time to replace your radiator cap. A lot of people don't realize the importance of this cap. It actually does regulate a lot of the pressure. Very important piece. So for what it's worth and just for the peace of mind and safety of your cooling system, just go ahead and just replace this every time you're doing a coolant service. It's really not worth it. Just what are they, $5, $10? Just change it out. Now's a good time to do it. All right, so here's where you can do me a favor. Like the video, if you liked it, of course. Consider subscribing to the channel. Helps me grow and build. Gets new videos rolling. Keeps me stoked. So we're basically done the cooling system. If you, at this point, if you've made any mess or anything like that, feel free, grab a hose, just spray it off. not a big deal, not really too concerned about that. You know, feel free to wash it, you know, do a nice job on that, no big deal. Like I said, let's drive the vehicle, make sure everything's fine there, keep some coolant with you. Next morning, next day, whatever it is, check it over a few times, make sure it's fully topped up, and there you go. You have yourself, you know, your new coolant in your vehicle. So, thanks so much for watching today, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye bye.